You take a country like Mozambique that has had a peace deal for over a dozen years now, Angola that is slowly but surely emerging out of a civil war for 30 years. The war continues in a very subtle way there because of the scourge of millions of landmines in our region. Surely the international community can help us to deal with this problem. We know that the attention span for Africa is often very limited, but I wish to make the case that if the Western powers will not send troops to Africa, which is not a possibility, I believe, in the near future, that they will in fact send troops. If they don't send troops, the least the Western powers can do in the spirit of partnership is to help to make the resources and the equipment available for Africans to keep their own peace.
For corruption to thrive, there must be a corruptee and a corruptor. And all too often, when we talk about Africa, we're talking about the corruptees. In fact, why we actually participate in corruption is that there are very, very, very keen and willing corruptors. And we would appeal to those that actually have the wherewithal, the facility to corrupt us, to withhold that facility from the corruption. It takes two to tango in corruption.
Africa wants a free trade deal. One of the most contentious issues in Africa's relationship with the outside world is, of course, this terrible problem of farm subsidies. The continent simply cannot compete with the kind of farming subsidies and prowess in Europe. That is a major challenge. And if those of us outside our governments really want to make a contribution to Africa, let's hold all our governments fire to the feet. Those of us in Europe and the West, and those of us in Africa. Let's remind our governments about the commitments they have made. I find it innovative. I find it refreshing that the continent is seeking a new relationship with the outside world. One based on genuine partnership, not a recipient-donor relationship. But that partnership must emphasize African priorities. It must be a transparent partnership. It must be free from old strings that we've set. It must be committed on a long-term basis as opposed to the short-term. And we must live up to both trade and aid. Then I want to say a word about the United Nations, literally a brief word. Nowhere in the United Nations Charter does it say everywhere but Africa. We're gonna have to remind the United Nations about its obligations towards the continent of Africa. Over 60% of agenda items are dominated by African affairs. And the UN, and particularly the UN Security Council, will have to become serious about partnership with Africa. Our institutions have shown their commitment to policy, but our institutions are very weak. The African Union works under the most unbelievable circumstances, but the African Union is overstretched. Its capacities are very thin. You only have 200 people working in the entire African Union Commission, having to service 53 nations.
Not possible to have good governance in a country if you don't finance the software of democracy, which means that the international community will have to understand that the crucial element for an African development to be possible is to create the conditions for a sustainable funding of the work of governments, parliaments, and the essential parts of public administration with decent salaries that allow for people not to be entirely subject to corruption and other forms of pressure. And this also needs to be massively accompanied by a huge investment in education, in training, and in the infra and infrastructures of the new knowledge-based economy and society to bridge the digital divide and to avoid that the emergence of a knowledge economy and the knowledge society becomes a major factor for impoverishment of the African continent. And the only way to succeed in a knowledge-based economy, in a knowledge-based society, is to have people educated, people trained, and this must be an absolute priority of all forms of cooperation with the African continent in the present situation. And beyond that, of course, access to trade. Beyond that, of course, access to foreign investment and creation of mechanisms of guarantee for that foreign investment to be possible. And of course, the need to have a much bigger effort in aid to the development of the continent. And of course, the need to implement effective eradication policies in relation to the big pandemics. There is a package of things that need to go all together. It's not possible just to go bit by bit or country by country. You need to have a global strategy and a global contract between the international community and the African continent. I do believe it's possible to work for that. It will probably not work everywhere, but there are many African countries where this is already possible now, and many others that, with sufficient support, can make it possible in the near future. And at the same time, you need to have a massive investment in peace, in the prevention of conflict, in conflict resolution, in creating the conditions for countries in transition to be effectively supported. If there is something the international community does not know how to handle, is the situations in transition after a conflict. The international community knows how to deliver humanitarian assistance. The international community knows more or less how to support the development process, but only when institutions are stable, only when rules are established. The bridge between emergencies and sustained development is a bridge that has never been built. And what we can now see in many African countries that have emerged from conflict is an extreme difficulty in having enough support for this difficult transition period. Many of the institutions, I remember that in Liberia again, the World Bank and the IMF are still getting, even if token of course, but they are still getting every year money from Liberia to pay for the arrears of the past debts. It is obvious that this is something that should have been forgotten. It is obvious that it does make sense to look blindly at a certain number of rules that obviously are meaningful in a context of stability and in the context of relative prosperity, but have no meaning at all when looking at a country that has been devastated by war, subject to the worst forms of dictatorship, and is trying to emerge for a new life and is trying to build a new society. This massive investment needs to be done in a coordinated way, respecting the identity and the strategies that the Africans have demonstrated within the context of the African Union that they are able to implement if the adequate conditions are there for that to be possible. It's a massive investment, but it is a duty for mankind. I don't think it is possible to go on looking at the African continent with the kind of indifference we are witnessing today.
I think the African Union itself must become serious about partnership with its own people. We don't show enough respect for partnership with African civil society institutions, African NGOs, and oftentimes when we talk partnership, it is too much partnership with the outside world and not enough partnership with our own people. Civil society actors, we should also familiarize ourselves with the elements of this new architecture because together we can build a prosperous and peaceful Africa. After all is said and done, we can pass policies and adopt policies that is very progressive, but unless we become serious ourselves as Africans about implementation, about making sure we live by these norms, these values, these principles, then our new peace architecture will mean very little.
We need peace. It is time for us to start constructing Africa. It is time for us to begin a new heart, calm, agile, courage. It is time for us to begin a new Africa, a new spirit, a warm spirit, the spirit that makes us to rebound. We don't want to remain grounded. We want to rebound and fly and fly and fly.